Welcome to the Low Carb Conferences podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Gerber, and we have a special guest today, Layne Norton. He'll be speaking at our conference in February. He's one of our triple threat presenters, as I like to call it, as he's passionate about fitness, nutrition, and science. So how's it going today, Layne?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to speak at the conference.
Well, great to have you here today and at the conference. Layne describes himself as a self-proclaimed nerd who lifts heavy things. He has a PhD in nutritional sciences and has a distinguished competitive athletic career in powerlifting, including national titles and other distinguished awards. Layne is a speaker, an innovator in the fitness industry, and has a popular online platform for nutrition coaching and contest preparation. Layne enjoys taking a deeper dive into the literature, looking for the best evidence supporting healthy approaches to fitness, nutrition, and lifestyle. Online, Layne is known as BioLayne, where he shares his knowledge, including posting, comments, and videos. His online persona is often abrasive when it comes to the nutrition debate. And although he's been criticized for that, it certainly makes for a lively discussion. So Layne, if you can provide a little background for us, tell us more about your personal and professional interests.
Yeah, so I'm afraid I'm not a very interesting person. I just really like to lift heavy things, and I like science, and I have a few other hobbies, but that eats up the majority of my time other than my family. So yeah, I got into this at a young age because I got into weightlifting as a means to try to get picked on less and try to get more attention from girls. It didn't help with either of those problems, but I ended up falling in love with training, lifting weights. And then that led me, long story short, led me to really get into nutrition and specifically protein. That was where a lot of my PhD research was. And then I did an undergraduate in biochemistry as well. So I kind of, when I went into college, knew I wanted to study science. And I started pretty broad. Originally, I was a biology major, and then I switched it to biochemistry, which actually ended up being a really great move for me. And then as I was finishing up my biochemistry degree, I just said, well, I just don't feel like I still know anything. So I'm supposed to be a professional, and just felt like I was kind of in that valley of despair on the Dunning-Kruger curve. And so I just felt like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I figure if I have a PhD, I hopefully won't be in the unemployment line, and just kind of set off to do it for those reasons. So throughout that whole course of time and doing my degrees and I was still lifting. I was competing in bodybuilding and then later in powerlifting, as you alluded to. And then I think what really helped me a lot, honestly, was just coaching so many people. So I was one of the first people to do online nutrition coaching. I'm pretty sure it had existed before that. I started in 2005, but I think I would say that I contributed to kind of popularizing that sort of thing. And have since 2005 have worked with over 2,000 people in a one-on-one capacity. And quite frankly, I will say I learned more from that than my own competitive endeavors, as well as my PhD. But I will say, I think doing the PhD allowed me to observe things that would happen with clients from a much more empirical sort of background and a much more skeptical background. I think it's, I have my own biases and whatnot from working with clients and just seeing, oh, well, this seems to work on average more than some of these other tools. But then I am constantly questioning, and I'm like, well, is that just selection bias? Is that me? That sort of thing. So I think I've always had this this skeptical mindset, which I do think in many ways been a blessing, and in some ways has been a curse. But those sort of things, I feel like my academics and then my coaching and then competing myself kind of gave me a unique perspective when it comes to a lot of these topics.
Well, I think you found a nice niche for yourself, Layne, And, I have to tell you, before I ever knew anything about nutrition, as a physician, it was the bodybuilders that came in to see me. This is 20, 30 years ago. And they were the ones that taught me about the nutrition and exercise. And it was only later when I started to research nutrition myself that I realized how right they were.
Yeah, I mean, I think, bodybuilders have been wrong about many things, but I think some of the what we've come to understand as the cruxes of nutrition, which is, if you want to get lean, there's many paths to Rome, but some form of restriction will be involved. Exercise is important, obviously, for building muscle. Progressive overload is important. We think protein is important. They were kind of ahead of the curve when it came to those sorts of things. And, it's easy to look back and say, well, yeah, of course, we knew that already. But then there was also many things that we as bodybuilders had claimed to know, that it turned out that it either wasn't true or it was true, but only because of this other, dependent variable and whatnot. So, but I think that experimentation on oneself as well as one's clients can be a very valuable lesson. We just have to be careful about how broadly we apply what we observe with ourselves and our clients to population as a whole.
Right. So another way to say that is one size does not fit all. And you have to look at the best evidence, and you have to experiment. And, gosh, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but in the real world, there's the real world, and then, there's best evidence. And so sometimes in the real world, you can't always apply best evidence, or there isn't even the best evidence out there to say that you should go in one direction. And I think your criticism online is when people make claims that aren't necessarily backed by the best evidence, that you have to be careful with what you say.
Yeah, and I think, my talk specifically is going to be on logical fallacies in nutrition. And I think, just my experience on Twitter alone, I think a lot of this is people not understanding how to properly communicate what they're saying. So or coming from a place of making certain assumptions, and then when somebody says something, they don't really listen to what the person said. They hear what the person says and then insert intention into that. So let me give an example of that, because I am known as somebody who hates low carb. I'm sure if you polled people in the low carb community and said, do you think Layne Norton likes low carb diets? The consensus would be no. And I will tell you that, I have a nutrition coaching app, and two of the settings are low carb variant. One is ketogenic, one is reduced carbohydrate. And no other nutritional strategy, by the way, has two options on our app. So my response is always, well, how could I be against low carb when there's two of those options on my app? And I think what people don't understand is I may say something like, a low carbohydrate diet does not appear to be superior for fat loss when you're equating calories and protein. That's what I'll say. What somebody will hear is, Layne said low carb diets don't work. I say, no. Or I'll get invariably somebody say, well, that's not true. I lost 50, 100 pounds on a low carb diet. Fantastic. That's not what I'm saying, right? So the question is never, does something work? The question is, does something work compared to a proper comparison of something else, right? Because if you look at these diet studies, there's actually quite a few diet studies out there where the comparator group is, hey, just keep doing what you're doing, right? And that's fine if the question is what we're doing better than the standard American diet? Well, we've already come to find out that pretty much anything is better than the standard American diet. So, just having something and saying, well, it works, it does, but it's important not to overdraw the conclusions from those sorts of research, right? And then some of the other things I'll see is, like false dichotomies, right? Somebody said, well, so for example, one of the things I'm known for is flexible dieting, which is where I wouldn't say I'm an advocate for it. It's something that I've found to be useful, and many of my clients find it to be useful, but it's not an appropriate tool for everybody. But under this context, I try to emphasize portion control, and hey, it's still okay to have some of these bad foods so long as you're accounting for them in your calories and just being reasonable about it. And so, and I'll show this research to show, hey, look, here's a study that did same macros, but they did, one group was high sugar, the other group was low sugar, and they didn't really see a difference in fat loss or health markers, right? And so what I'll get is, well, are you saying that eating all your calories from protein shakes and Pop-Tarts is as good as insert whatever diet you want? And my response is always, why do I have to choose one or the other? Like, why can't I have a diet that's mostly minimally processed stuff, controlling calories, and then if I have some left over, still have a little bit. And so you can start to see how, if you can't recognize these sorts of logical fallacies, how somebody could get crossed up. Because if I was having a discussion with somebody else, I might have a really hard time justifying my position if they bring up well, are you saying it's going to be, if you do this? And the point is, well, that's not really a reasonable comparison, because quite frankly, people just don't eat like that, right? There's nuance to this stuff.
Yeah. So, we've discussed that perhaps there's just you're misunderstood in terms of what you're saying, but
it's the media.
But to create a dichotomy that isn't necessarily there. That it's good for debate, but then at the end of the day, it's kind of confusing for people. And I've been following you're on the things that you're doing. Your online videos are fantastic on Instagram. I know you put a lot of work into it, but for myself, I've given some presentations where I pit the low carb community against the calorie. Calories versus hormones. And it's great to put them up against each other. But the thing is, and I think we both agree that there are some common themes there. And it's not that one's more important than the other. They both play a significant role in health and nutrition, if I'm correct.
Well, I think that the bigger pertinent point is that calories affect hormones and vice versa, right? So none of this stuff operates in a vacuum. It's, I think a lot of people have said, well, calories in versus calories out doesn't account for hormones. I've heard that kind of phrasing before. And what I'll say is, it depends on what kind of model of calories in, calories out you're talking about. If you're talking about kind of the model from 30 years ago, which is static, which is, well, calories out don't really change. And so if you want to lose half a pound a week, just cut out 250 calories out of what you're tracking. Whereas what we understand now, it's a dynamic model where, well, one, we can't exactly know how many calories you're taking in, but we can get a relatively good idea. But we also don't really know how many calories you're expending either, unless we have some time to accumulate some data, some body weight data, or we're putting you in a metabolic chamber, those sorts of things. And, oh, by the way, if we reduce your calories, that doesn't operate in a vacuum either. That has downstream effects on your hormone levels and is going to, over time, likely reduce your energy expenditure. But that is not a calorie issue. That is an issue with any diet. And I've seen people in various nutritional diet tribes, not just low carb, but say things like, well, you don't want to do calories in, calories out. And when they say that, they're actually just talking about tracking your calories. Because if you cut calories, it reduces your metabolic rate. And the answer and the response to that is, yes, it does. But that's true of any variation of diet, whether it's intermittent fasting, low carb, low fat, whatever. they've basically all shown to have similar effects on what we call metabolic adaptation, which is kind of a reduction in metabolic rate commensurate with, decrease in body weight and calories. And so, the issue is that we're many times, especially on nutrition Twitter, people are talking past each other, right? So I'm saying calories matter. It is about creating a calorie deficit. And what somebody else hears is hormones don't matter. Everybody's the same, and X, Y, Z. And the fact of the matter is, no, everybody's not the same, psychologically or necessarily physiologically. Like we do know but people don't often like the answers as to why we're not the same. So, for example, if you look at energy expenditure, which is kind of the amount of calories you utilize or you burn in a day, right? The intra-individual variability really seems to boil down to mostly differences in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is, basically your non-purposeful movements throughout the day. So, I tend to be a pretty relatively fidgety person, whereas my wife doesn't move. So it's like, if you look at, my calories are about what you'd expect for somebody with my level of lean body mass, but hers are much, much lower than you would expect for someone with her level of lean body mass. And much of that is just, she's not a fidgety person. She doesn't pace. Like, her only movement she does is when she goes outside and says, I'm going for a walk for an hour today because I know I'm not going to be active otherwise. So I think people, since non-exercise activity thermogenesis tends to get just lumped in with physical activity, people hear, well, the differences in energy expenditure appear to not be from basal metabolic rate, which you really don't see much difference in basal metabolic rate between individuals. There is some, but it's relatively odd to see somebody with a slow or fast BMR. So people hear, well, it's differences in physical activity, and they go, well, they're saying that I'm lazy and I don't exercise. Not really, because NEAT is not something that's within your control. That is a physiological phenomenon that is not subject to conscious regulation. So I think, again, it's like talking past each other, right? I'm saying, well, physical activity seems to matter. It seems to be very individual through changes in NEAT. And what other person hears is, well, Layne's saying that people who become obese are just lazy. Not what I'm saying, but it might be what somebody else hears. And so when I talk, a lot of times that's why I am so long-winded when I give a response to a question, because I am already thinking about how other people may interpret this, or more specifically, misinterpret this. And I've had it so many times where I haven't given my thoughts all the way through on an answer. Somebody hears it, goes and says, well, Layne said this. And then I read that and I'm like, yeah, I mean, I did, but it's completely out of context from what I said.
Yeah, very interesting stuff, Layne. And I like how you said that energy expenditure is really affected by what's going on throughout the day, just fidgeting and walking and moving. And it reminds me, we just got this electronic health record the last couple months in our office. And we've just been sitting on our butts most of the day, and really concerning to me. So we're making an exerted effort to get up and move around, in addition to going to the gym. But you're saying it's the what you're doing in between the gym that is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and for some people, so NEAT is so variable. This is just a random interesting fact that some people may really enjoy. It appears to be modifiable by up to around 1,000 calories a day. So there was
what is NEAT?
Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So just like fidgeting, pacing. So basically any non-purposeful physical activity that you do during a day. So I have heard people say, well, I'm going to go outside, do a walk and get my NEAT up. And my response is, that's exercise. That's not NEAT, because you are saying I'm going to go do it. NEAT is like, if I'm up on stage and I'm speaking, I'll use my hands a lot. I'll do a lot of gestures. That's NEAT. I'm not purposely trying to do that. It's just happening, right? Same thing. If I'm on the phone, I tend to pace around a lot. That's not me deciding to pace, I'm just doing that, right? Or if I'm like tapping my leg, while I'm sitting, a lot of people do that. That is not a conscious decision, but it is a way for your body to dissipate energy. And they have shown when you reduce calories and you start to reduce body weight, that non-purposeful energy is pretty modifiable. And they even see with like a loss of like 10% of body weight, it can reduce NEAT by up to 400 calories a day. So again, people kind of have this idea that these are just, that if their metabolism is slowing or their energy expenditure is going down, it must be their basal metabolic rate. And really the changes in basal metabolic rate that we see are usually not very sensational. It really appears to get modified through physical activity, much more so. And the really interesting thing is there was a study done in 1995, and I think it was Layne, is who I think it was. And they overfed people by around 1,000 calories a day for, I think what was like 4 weeks or something like that. And obviously the majority of people gained a significant amount of body weight. Some people gained more, some people gained less, but the gap between the person who gained the most and the least was like 7 kilograms. So there was a massive difference, even though it was the same calorie surplus, it began as the same calorie surplus. But the person who was on the very low end, what was really interesting is they just spontaneously increased their physical activity almost to the point where they didn't have very much weight gain at all. I think they gained like a kilo, if that. So it's just really interesting to see, and people who are kind of an obese resistant phenotype, we've heard of these before. It's not that they can eat whatever they want because their metabolism's so fast. It's that when they overeat, they tend to just get much more fidgety, and they tend to like it's almost like a compulsion that they have to move. So their body does a really great job at dissipating this excess energy. Whereas people who are obese prone, they don't really get that response. At least we don't think they do. And then the other portion of that is people who are obese resistant appear to have way tighter regulation of their appetite compared to those who become obese. That, there's certain kind of, breaks on appetite that occur with people who are obese resistant, we'll call it. And the really interesting thing is, actually, I'm kind of going on a side tangent, but if you look at one of the things exercise does, a lot of people look at exercise as a tool to burn calories. And it does do that, but I think the bigger impact it has, there's really good evidence that it actually exerts a lot of its weight loss benefits by sensitizing your brain to satiety signals. That if you exercise, it actually makes you more sensitive to satiety signals. Because if energy regulation worked the way that we think it should, if somebody starts exercising more, you'd think they would just get hungrier. But if anything, the opposite is actually true in the research literature, that exercise has a slightly, at least amongst people who are overeating, has a slightly anorectic effect. So very interesting.
Yeah, Layne, no, thanks for all that. Getting back to the original point is that I would like to be the person where we have all these self-indulgences where we take in more and our body reacts by doing good, healthy things, but not everybody works that way. And so
very few.
Yeah. And so the question is, you also said, well, if you decrease calories going in, your body tends to reduce thermogenesis. And so, what are some of the tricks to kind of overcome this? So, an individual that wants to get healthy, wants to lose weight, wants to build muscle, how do you balance, I like to call it, energy balance rather than calories in, calories out. So, you alluded to some of the things that you want to do, but maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, on a practical level, I think the thing to consider is, and I'm going to speak for people who are are kind of like obese, trying to become, normal weight or lean. Whatever you have kind of settled into in terms of your body fat level is now kind of your kind of a steady state, if you will. And when you enter into weight loss, there's going to be, you're now in a dynamic phase where things are changing. And so I think one of the things to realize is the tools that are going to be required to get you to wherever you want to go, they may change. The behaviors and habits are going to have to be the same, but the tools may change. And what I mean by that is perhaps calorie tracking is a thing you have to do for a while to aware yourself to portion sizes. I'll tell this to people all the time, like, listen, if I have you tracking macros or I have you doing XYZ, it's not that I'm saying you have to like weigh out every single piece of food that goes in your mouth for the rest of your life. That's not what I'm saying. But, just like if nobody's ever kept a budget before and you go and you start categorizing your expenses, I mean, most of us get a holy crap moment, where we go, oh my God, like I had no idea I was spending that much money on whatever, Uber Eats and that sort of thing. Same token, many of us just don't have a good concept of how many calories that we're actually taking in. And, I've just seen this so many times that people, or you'll have people who they track calories, but it's really like they go have a bowl of cereal. They look at the box and they go, okay, 1 serving goes in MyFitnessPal. When in reality, they just had 3 servings in a bowl, right? So I think that, that tool of kind of tracking can be extremely helpful, especially during that dynamic phase when your body's going to be sending signals like this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, because it's trying to maintain homeostasis in its steady state, so that you have something else to draw on. By the same token, when it comes to like the reductions in spontaneous physical activity, we can't fully capture that, unfortunately, unless people want to start wearing accelerometers on their hip, knee, and elbow joints, which I don't think is a very sustainable long-term solution. But one thing I will say is, tracking steps can be somewhat of a useful tool, because if you think about it, if I go in the gym and I train hard for an hour and then I do a 30-minute walk or whatever, and I get to the end of the day, my steps are 10,000. Great, right? Maybe that's kind of my average. But then I start becoming spontaneously less active. It won't all show up in steps, but some of it will show up in steps. I'll pace less, those sorts of things. And so having that step count can be useful. So you can say, okay, when I'm starting this diet, I can see my average steps are say 8,000 a day, and I'm just going to try and maintain that, right? Like whatever that requires to maintain. And at a certain point that may require, some extra purposeful walking, that sort of thing. But if you're not tracking it, it's hard to know. And so I'm not saying that somebody has to track their steps again, for the rest of their life. But when you're in this dynamic phase of trying to lose weight, until those habits become really ingrained in terms of exercise and nutrition, until those habits become really ingrained, having that objective data that you can look at and go, okay, is this on the right track, pointing me in the right direction? I think that can be really helpful.
Great, Layne. Well, it's interesting sitting back here. I'm thinking, well, the low carb community is going to say, oh, well, you're just talking about, calories and exercise at this point. But you brought up a good point. And again, we want to really try to find some common themes. And that's why we want you at this conference. And I would tell you that from the low carb perspective, looking at hormones, that the hormones are affected by the energy is affecting the hormones. It's both related. And we both agree that the calories and the hormones both count. And I can give you my own personal example that, I had substantial weight loss, 40 pounds, some 20 plus years ago. And it really was through a low carb diet. And you had mentioned about tracking. And one of the things that I found when I did this dietary approach is that I was always satiated, and I thought I was gorging on food, that nothing had changed. But, my wife had said, Jeff, look at the bill from the supermarket. You're eating substantially less food. And I would agree with her. And so to my point is, whatever I did, it controlled hormones, it controlled calories, and I lost weight and I felt great. And so moving along on that point, Layne, and I would tell you that I had an insulin resistance problem. I had some prediabetes. And so the question to lay out is, how would you approach diet in an individual that's not healthy? Let's, say they're pre-diabetic versus, and they're overweight. Okay, so we see that group of people. And then we have the other group of people that they want to lose weight, but they're actually fairly metabolically healthy, insulin sensitive. And so the question, is the approach different?
So I think the approach is different from person to person, but I think it has much more to do with whatever that individual finds to be easiest to adhere to, as opposed to, well, we're looking for physiological differences and we're going to fit the diet to those physiological differences. Like if we look at, some of the studies out there that look at genetics or biomarkers in the blood, metabolites, those sorts of things, and have attempted to create diets around those. And there are probably half a dozen studies up to this point that have done that sort of thing. There was actually just one published recently looking at genetic polymorphisms and trying to kind of adapt a best diet for that. And what they tend to find is it doesn't seem to make a difference, at least thus far. Now, I'm not saying that will never be the case, but based on the technology we have at this point in our understanding, we just haven't seen those differences. And that fits with the long-term data. If we look out over the long-term data, like the Diet Fit study gets cited a lot and whatnot, it really, at the end of the day, the biggest impact to overall health is going to be, for the obese person, is going to be, can we get a reduction in adipose tissue? Because once adipose tissue becomes too large, not only are you limited, because adipocytes don't like to get much more over 100 microns in diameter. That's kind of like where they start to max out. And once you've maxed out what you can put into fat cells, it becomes harder. And that's where the insulin resistance comes in, where you've now got excess metabolites in the bloodstream. And that goes for amino acids, free fatty acids, glucose. Everything kind of starts backing up into the bloodstream because you've just run out of places to put it, for lack of a better term. And so if we look at, people with insulin resistance, obesity, and we look at, like a high carb diet, a low carb diet, and we look at the long-term outcomes, really what makes the difference is just losing a significant amount of body weight. Now, I will say that in the short term, those blood markers may resolve themselves slightly faster on a low carb diet. So there is some data to suggest that in that first 3-month window, and this is if we equate for weight loss, because that's important. There are some low carb studies that show better resolution a little bit further out, but they also had more weight loss, which again, a dependent variable. So it's important to account for that. So if you equate for weight loss, in the first couple of months, it appears that a low carb diet may get some resolution of blood glucose and blood insulin, those sorts of things, a little more quickly than a calorie equated high carb diet. But if we look at out over the long term, they don't appear to be different, and it appears to mostly be tied to how much body fat is lost. So what my takeaway from that is, if you like a low carb diet and it is sustainable for you and it's something that you can adhere to and you don't have problems with it, great, do that. But by the same token, what I'll tell people is hey, if you're type 2 diabetic, but you're really having a hard time adhering to a low carb diet, listen, you don't have to do this. There's other tools that you can use to achieve a similar or same outcome. And I think that's where, again, messaging is really important. If somebody is able to do a low fat diet, lose a substantial amount of weight, all the research says they will likely improve their insulin sensitivity and blood glucose and resolve those type 2 diabetic, that type 2 diabetic profile. So if somebody says, hey, that's actually easier for me and I have an easier time sticking to it, okay, no problem. Same thing with intermittent fasting, right? Like I've had so many people who have said, hey, I like intermittent fasting because it just feels like I'm not even dieting. In fact, Jeff, what you alluded to, feeling like you were, I feel like I'm eating even more. People with intermittent fasting say that. And I think a lot of this stuff boils down to, with intermittent fasting, obviously there's not a lot of snacks because you're not eating for most of the day. And then with low carb, there's not a lot of snacking because there's not a lot of low carb snacks. You know what I mean? Like there's not. And so I think people are used to, when they snack, it's not really a satiating thing. And the foods that are eaten for snacks aren't usually very satiating either. And I think there's also like a conscious thing, right? So people remember their meals. They don't really remember their snacks. That's something that people don't, because snacking tends to be more subconscious. It's not as active as I'm sitting down for this meal and I'm having this meal. So I think a lot of times, especially people on low carb or plant-based or whatever kind of restrictive diet you want to put out there, what they're actually having a phenomenon of is, wow, I'm actually eating a very satisfying large meal. And then they're just not snacking, and people just don't, without even realizing it, are blown away by how much they may have been snacking before. So, but when it comes to like, what's the best diet for, somebody who's metabolically sick versus metabolically not sick, we don't have a ton of studies on this, but there was one study that looked at it was actually in liquid diets, ironically, but they looked at people who were obese type 2 diabetes or obese non-type 2 diabetes, normal blood markers. And they found that under the same calories, both groups lost the same amount of weight and had similar improvements in their blood markers. The type 2 diabetics actually had a little bit better improvement in their blood markers, but that makes sense because they were already dysregulated to begin with. So again, it's one of those things where I kind of start from the perspective of what can we get people to stick to long term? Because if you can do low carb, great, and maybe you'll get a little bit quicker resolution of those markers, but we really need to be looking at the long term. And so if somebody says to me like, man, I hate this low carb diet, I just can't seem to do it, or I'm binging on the weekends because I feel so unsatisfied. Well, okay, let's look at a different tool. But if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I really like low carb, it's something I can stick to, I can't tell you how many clients I've had, do low carb. I wouldn't say it's more than any other sort of dietary approach, but there's been a significant portion. And I think, personal preference is very, very important. And I think the one other kind of logical fallacy in this whole thing is I don't really have an actual logical fallacy term for it, but it's kind of, well, I did this diet and it felt so easy for me, so it will feel easy for everybody else, right? So, I mean, I was like that with flexible dieting because that's how I was able to kind of control my body weight and modify my body composition. And I just thought, well, I get to eat whatever I want. All I got to do is track it. I mean, this is easy. Anybody will want to do this. And it turns out, no, there's some people who absolutely hate tracking their calories. It feels very restrictive to them and they'd rather do something else.
Sure. Well, great, Layne. One of the things you say is that there are tools out there. These are just tools that people can use. And so what we have found in our clinical practice is that we like to screen for insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. And that gives us a guideline in terms of how we start out with the patient. And so the insulin resistant individuals, as you say, they seem to do better initially with more of a low carb diet. But if you take those same principles and apply it to someone that's insulin sensitive, they're not going to have results. They're actually going to struggle with the low carb type of diet. And the other point that you said about long term, what is it that we're going to want to do with individuals? And I tell you that, we have these insulin resistant pre-diabetic and diabetic patients, and they have successful weight loss. And, one of the things when you lose weight is there's less of you, so you're not as hungry. So there's some success going on there. But the thing is, the way the diet looks down the road is a lot different than when you start. And, I often tell people that there's kind of a similarity down the road that, in terms of really you need to back down on fat because fat is very caloric dense and that needs to be considered. Uh, we think that protein is good. Various sources of protein. We tend to focus more on the animal-based proteins, but there can be some healthy plant-based proteins. And long term down the road, it's not just about carbohydrates. So I think there's some similarities to how the diet looks long term as people become more metabolically healthy, or if they were insulin sensitive, the long term plan is more kind of like the initial plan. That's how we deal with it here in the office. And so, yeah. So, what are your comments about that?
Yeah, I think the one pushback I might have is I think that if I had a person who was insulin resistant, low carb is certainly an option. And obviously, if you can resolve their blood markers faster, that's a bonus. But I'd probably start with, hey, what kind of foods do you enjoy? What makes you feel satisfied? Where if I gave you the option of we had to take something out here, in terms of these foods or these foods, like where do you feel like would be something that you could be consistent with, right? And kind of start there. And I think that kind of coming up with a idea of, okay, what's going to allow this person to be most adherent to the diet, and kind of starting there. But for a lot of people, especially people who are overweight, obese, have type 2 diabetes, a lot of times they have quite a bit of diet history. They have trust issues with not feeling like anything will work for them. And so I think one of the benefits to low carb is usually people see results pretty quickly, even if a lot of it's just, body water. When people see, they're a week in and 5 to 10 pounds went down the scale, that can be really encouraging for some folks, and you get a better buy-in. And so I do think that there's benefits to that. But as you pointed out, like looking out long term, doing a really and it doesn't matter the type of diet, like doing a really hardcore approach diet for kind of, any of the different diet tribes, it becomes difficult long term to sustain. And that's why we see so much weight recidivism. So I think, even if we're starting them out with something that's a little bit more restrictive, teaching them, those overall habits over the long term of, hey, like if you have a desire to eat carbohydrates in the future, no problem. But here's what things are going to have to look like if we're adding them back in, like those sorts of things. Because what you don't want to have happen is their only tool they've got is, well, don't eat carbs. And then they have, a slip up where they're on a cruise or whatever, and they don't have access to the same foods they're used to. And they end up just blowing out because they go, well, I can't do this, so I might as well just eat whatever I want. Whereas ideally, you'd rather be able to make them pivot and say, okay, well, I know the normal foods I have, but I know how to control my portion sizes, those sorts of things, so that, people still have got some tools to work with.
Yeah. So, we make it clear to patients from the get-go that it's not about just watching carbs, and it's much more complicated than that. And just one comment is that we follow the patients clinically here in the office, and we do body comp analysis, and it is clear that they're losing body fat, maintaining muscle mass from whatever the tool is that we're using, and it works. And I think that we see the metabolic issues improve, and we see the patient lose weight, and health is improving. They're eating less at the end of the day. So I'm just trying to summarize some of the things that you're saying, and there are some common themes, including mindfulness, which is we haven't talked about that, but you kind of alluded to that as well, that you pay attention to your body, how you feel, what foods are satiating, what foods are not satiating. And certainly, processed foods are terrible. And we see that driving people's appetites all the time, and the food industry is very good at manipulating the science to just drive appetite. So the mindfulness and feeling happy with what you're doing and not forcing anything, I think that's a component of something we both agree.
Now, we've become very disconnected from our appetite signals. I'm included in this. Like, to be honest, like I use my app and I track food, and I feel satisfied at the end of the day. But we've become very disconnected from our appetite signals, and that's not surprising with the reduction in physical activity, and also the introduction of a lot of ultra processed foods. And I'm not somebody who demonizes the food industry, only from the perspective of, as a business owner, I'm trying to sell things to people, and I'm trying to create products they like so that they'll buy more of them. And that's kind of what the food industry does, right? It's like, it just ends up being one of these unfortunate effects of trying to run a business where, like, hey, if healthy foods were getting ripped off the shelves, I mean, food companies would make more of those. You know what I mean? So, I kind of don't take it's one of those things where I tell people, you got to be aware of it, but try to be careful with the intentionality behind it, right? So when it comes to that sort of stuff, like being mindful and thinking about when you go in to eat something and saying to yourself, am I eating because I'm hungry, or am I eating because, and now insert whatever, I'm stressed. I didn't sleep well. I'm using this as a comfort. I'm in a certain social situation where it feels like I should eat. And believe it or not, I mean, there's a lot of those. Am I in a context where I typically eat? Like, I'm sitting down to watch TV and I'm going to have some food to snack on because that's like part of my habit of what I do. And so, like, just trying to understand that. And one of the things I'll tell people, because a lot of people get hung up on hunger, and I'll tell you, hunger and appetite are two different things. So hunger is physiological. I have not eaten. I am hungry. Appetite is all the other stuff. And I'll tell people, like, I think hunger is one of the last reasons people eat, if I'm being honest. I think there's a lot of other reasons that people eat besides hunger. Because if you've ever done a long fast, you know that hunger is not persistent. It eventually subsides. Now, it may come in waves and it'll come back, especially if you're doing a very long fast. But it's not something that's persistent. It's not if you think about it from a teleological perspective, it's not advantageous for you to be hungry all the time, even if you were in an energy deficit, because it becomes impossible for you to just concentrate on other things. And so, yeah, I think getting back in touch with satiety signals and mindfulness is something that's really underrated. Probably because it's not a hack and it takes some work and it's hard. But I do think that that's something very important.
Yes, thanks, Layne. So, I support industry. It's just, unfortunate that some of the things that industry has laid into is sometimes not to the best of the interest of the health of individuals. But this is where it's important to the individual to look carefully at what they're consuming, and make sure that
being educated about it, right?
Be educated,
like being able to make an informed decision.
Yeah, absolutely, Layne. And I guess we agree to the mindfulness. And so I guess we can kind of finish up here. It's funny. You're coming in as a very fit person, and for instance, I'm 61 and just trying to stay healthy, and I love going to the gym and I've been building up muscle, but the audience might say, well, why should I take advice from this muscle bound guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, certainly, looks different, whatnot. I guess the reason I would say to take advice from me is, one, I back it up with citations, but also I've coached a lot of people, and not just people who, got ready for bodybuilding stage. I've helped a lot of people who have lost quite a bit of weight, who were type 2 diabetic, those sorts of things. But really, I tell people, like, to be ready on a bodybuilding stage it's actually still the exact same principles that you need to make an obese person not obese. It's just taking them really far to the absolute impossibility of how it's done, right? And so I think those are the big differences. Like, obviously, bodybuilders can be so neurotic. Like when I was getting ready for a show, I mean, I'd go to spray my pan, before I'd go cook something, and I would take the spray, I'd weigh it, and then I'd spray it, and I'd weigh it afterwards to know how many grams of oil I just, put on my pan. That level of neuroticism, while possibly helpful to get incredibly lean, not needed for, general weight loss, obviously. But the principle, which is I am watching what I'm putting in my body and I'm having, some accounting, that principle is helpful and needed for most people. So again, it's kind of one of those things where the tools, not the tools, but the directionality of the behaviors is the same. It's just that the bodybuilders and really fit people are taking those behaviors to the absolute extreme, because I mean, it's an extreme sport. You're trying to have as absolutely much muscle as you possibly can and as absolutely little body fat as we can.
Well, you're not one of the, you're just one of several triple threats coming to the event. And I really want to push the issue of the importance of maintaining healthy skeletal muscle throughout life. And that's why you and several others are coming. And the idea, Layne, for you to be here again is for you to share perspective in a professional setting and to, educate the audience. And we were joking that we want to be sure that there's no fist fights in the audience, because you're likely to win that battle.
Well, I won't be getting any fist fights with anybody. I always say, you know what, I'm not anti-low carb, and especially when people reach across the aisle in terms of like, a place I might not think would be interested in having me speak, I absolutely want to do that, because otherwise I'm just sitting in my own echo chamber and I'm not actually getting out to people who might be interested in a different perspective. So yeah, I'm super excited to be there, and I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Well, we're glad to have you. And what do you enjoy about coming to events like this in person?
Oh, I love in-person speaking. I love it. It's what I live for. I really, really enjoy the process of being on stage. And I mean, you can see when you're looking at the audience, like I've had so many times where I could just see that light bulb go off for somebody, and to me, like, that's like when you've got people's attention and they're captivated and they're listening intently, and that's just the best thing in the world for me. And I'll probably sound cocky, but I really do think when it comes to conveying evidence-based information in a palatable and entertaining format, I do believe I'm one of the best people in the world. And hopefully I get a chance to back up me saying that when I come to the conference.
Well, that's great, Layne. We are looking forward. And so how can the audience find out more about you?
Yeah, so I'm BioLayne on pretty much any social media, and that's my website, biolayne.com, and you can find all our products and services that we offer through there, and all my content on social media by just checking out BioLayne.
Great. And I like following you on Instagram and Twitter especially. So to our audience, thanks for listening. And if you're interested in attending the conference in February of 2023, please visit lowcarbconferences.com for more information. So until next time, and thanks again, Layne.
No problem. Thanks for having me.